Ladies and gentlemen, let us start. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you both here in the room and online to our meeting with experts from different European countries, also living in Asia, who will be discussing political factors in China's economic strategy towards the EU, but in reality probably will be just having a deep discussion on European Union, China, economic relations and how they influence the way business is done between China and European Union partners. It's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests. So maybe starting from my immediate neighbor. On my right-hand side is Alicia Garcia Herrero from Bruegel, from Brussels, who is also a very active member of the China Horizons DWARC Research Consortium. Welcome, Alicia, to Poland and to our panel. Next is Jens Eskalund, who is president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. And this is probably the best person to talk to us about what business for European partners really looks like in China from within China. So thank you, Jens, for coming over. Next up is Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, who resides in Hong Kong, but he is representing Asia Center in Paris. And he's also a member like Jens Eskalund, also of the China Horizons Consortium. And last but not least is Françoise Nicolas, who is a senior advisor to the Center of Asian Studies at the French Institute of International Relations. And she also represents another consortium doing research on China, which is ReConnect China. So here we have not only practical experts and researchers on China and EU-China relations, but also people who represent two different consortiums funded by the European Commission working on China research. My name is Marcin Jacobi. I'm from this university, from SWPS University here in Warsaw, Poland. I'm also a member of the China Horizons Research Consortium. Now, we have many topics to cover, and maybe in order to have a good start, it's best to discuss what are the main geopolitical issues that are affecting China-European Union relations. Now, I'm asking this question also in relation to the recent documents and the research we've been doing at the consortia. And the documents that I would like to quote is first the Business Confidence Survey that is done yearly by the European Commission Chamber in China and shows quite interesting or even concerning developments. The last survey that was published recently for 2024. Another one is a report, Riskful Thinking, Navigating the Politics of Economic Security, and we'll be probably talking about the content of that report as well. And probably you have all read and listened and watched in the media about very difficult issues happening around the world that are also very visibly changing the atmosphere between China and European Union as far as any cooperation is concerned, not only the economic cooperation. So let's start off with some of the main geopolitical issues that are affecting relations between China and European Union. Who wants to start? Jean-Pierre?
Well, thank you, Marcin. Thank you to your university for inviting us here. It's a very nice place, and happy to be back in Warsaw. Well, I think I would start with domestic politics, maybe. I think we have the feeling that in Europe that China is going the wrong direction. There was an expectation for a long time in the EU that China, will be moved from a political point of view towards more freedom, more openness, and maybe eventually towards democracy. And of course, that dream has been killed by Xi Jinping, not only Xi Jinping, but the Communist Party as a whole, which is going in the other direction, putting more control over the society, putting dissent in jail, trying to unify all the minorities under the Han ethnic group, which is the majority group in China. So that's the domestic context. The other thing is China has become more and more anti-US. And we are US allies, we are NATO members. So it's getting harder and harder for the most EU member states to be on the same page as China. Now, I would add to that the fact that now we have a war in Ukraine. which instead of dividing the EU and America, is bringing the American and the Europeans together. So we have more transatlantic cooperation and unity, in particular triggered by the war in Ukraine. As you know, China on the paper is neutral as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. We joke very often saying that China is a pro-Russian neutral, has adopted a pro-Russian neutrality. China is helping Russia in many ways because it's bête noire, as we say in French. It's NATO and the US. So that puts us in a very difficult situation. I will not mention, because other speakers are much more competent than I am, on the economic issue, but the deepening trade deficit with China is another issue. The fact that since China has been admitted in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, we're having a very difficult partner, which was supposed to move toward a market economy, but China has not moved towards a market economy. The industries in China, many of the top industries, the leading industries, are heavily subsidized by the state, and they're playing another ball game. So, and it has triggered a lot of debates within Europe how to adapt to this new China, which is more and more powerful. But also, I would just finish on these first preliminary remarks, the fact that China is also more threatening outside of its perimeter, threatening Taiwan more and more obviously, intruding in the Taiwan Defense Identification Zone, giving a hard time to other claimants in the South China Sea. The latest example, of course, is being illustrated by tensions with the Philippines around the St. Thomas Shoal. And of course, Japan as well, around the Senkaku, which has been claimed by China since the 70s. So more tension in the neighborhood of China, and that's not helping either, because we can't ignore the fact that, if China starts a war with its neighbors, it's going to have implications for European nations and for the European Union as a whole. And that's something which, even if we don't have any stake as far as the Indo-Pacific security is concerned, we have an important interest in that part of the world.
All right, so very deep disappointment with the way China has been going, and very deep concerns. So, and Ukrainian war is certainly a very important factor here. What are the other geopolitical factors that are painting this rather pessimistic landscape? Alicia.
Me, okay.
Jens, okay, go ahead.
We just heard Jean-Pierre talk about some of the issues relating to for example, Ukraine, and what we focus on naturally in the EU Chamber of Commerce is more things that are related to trade. And there also we are beginning to see the effects of a clear political focus in China, in particular as regards supporting the supply side, and not really working on what is the major problem now in terms of creating balances in the economy, and that is to see if you can do things for the demand side instead. And that's one of the reasons that we talk so much about overcapacity right now, simply because this demand here makes it necessary for Chinese manufacturers to export it. And we're beginning to see, and again, I think we need to be clear, it's a political decision to support the supply side rather than the demand side. So the solution also needs to be political in the sense that it's a matter of how you choose to allocate your resources. But we're beginning really to see it now in trade terms. If you go back to 2019, every time Europe exported one container to China, China was exporting 2.7 containers to Europe. Fast forward to 2022, that was a year when Europe has the largest ever trade deficit with China, almost 400 billion euro. At that point in time, the trade deficit has deteriorated to 1 to 3.22. Now, MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce, will tell you that the trade deficit has narrowed last year and Chinese exports actually has declined. Yes, in value terms. But if you look at the proportion, it has actually widened even further to 1 to 3.76. And my guess is that in the present year, it might even surpass the 1 to 4. And I think here in Poland, where we are today, is really not looking good. It's 1 to 17. So I think you are at an extreme end.
We are one of the leaders.
Yeah,
Thank you.
but part of the reason for that is, of course, that you are exporting also components to Germany that are then being assembled and going out. But for Europe as a whole, we are surpassing 1 to 4. But I actually don't think this is sort of the most interesting fact. If you go back to 2017, that's a 6-year period, possibly the Chinese economy has grown by 35-40% conservatively in that period of time. But in that period of time where the Chinese economy has grown by 40%, imports from Europe in volume terms are actually down by 30%. Now, and that is the question. How can you have a trade partner, the world's second largest economy, growing 40% and European exports are down by 30%? Alicia has done some phenomenal studies on that demonstrates the extent to which that China is actually decoupling from the rest of the world in terms of the amount of components that China is importing in order for their own production. Whereas in Europe, it's the opposite that is taking place, that Europe is increasingly importing. And that is because there is a fundamental difference at how you look at trade and how you prioritize whether you are a Chinese company, in particular a state-owned enterprise, or you are a European company. In European company, we get our competitiveness by having, sourcing the components that we need where we can get the highest quality at the lowest price. We're looking all over the world, and very often that place is China. Now, China, the calculation is a little bit different. It is, how can we create, even though it takes a little bit time and maybe we have to buy an inferior product for a higher price until we are able to produce at the price point that we need. So for China, in many cases, the overriding priority has been, how can we sort of make a domestic integrated value chain rather than scoring the whole world to see where you can find the cheapest product. And that, frankly, has been a problem for many of us. And that's the reason also there has been this high focus on in China, for China, because it's a matter of establishing domestic supply chains. What has happened, though, that I think is very interesting, we saw in our latest business confidence survey that we published just 1 month ago, is that by far the biggest concern right now is the domestic Chinese economy and the lack of demand. So it looks like, at least for some companies in China, for China is beginning to become a liability. Export is actually doing pretty well, and export to Europe are also holding up. And that's, of course, a problem for Europe because we still have a situation with low demand growth here. So if whatever little demand there is in Europe is being satisfied from China, that means that jobs are going to go in Europe. And that's a problem. And I think that's the sources of many of the tensions that we are seeing right now. And again, in the case of China, with, for example, the focus now on new quality productive forces, which is what Europe is good at, I think we're in for a ride. So buckle up. The next 2 years will be interesting. Thanks.
So it's getting more and more difficult, not only on the geopolitical side, but also on Chinese economic policy side, where Europe is less and less needed as an exporter to China and still needed as an importer of Chinese products, which doesn't really play into our hands. Any other factors to start with?
Okay, well, let me elaborate perhaps on something, on two things that have been said by the two other speakers. The first thing is about, China being anti-US. Jean-Pierre said that. I agree with him. And I think that we can date this to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. This is, I think, a watershed moment for China. It is a period when China finally realized that the economic clout that it had could be used for political purposes, for geopolitical purposes. And this is when China started becoming more assertive. So everybody blames Xi Jinping, but I guess Xi Jinping is to be blamed to some extent, but not exclusively him. I think the situation in China had changed, and so it's to some extent emboldened China. And so China realized that it could actually bully the others even more forcefully than in the past. So I think it was a very important moment. That's one first thing. And on the role of the political factors, I think that there is a major difference between the way China works and the way the EU works. While China and Chinese companies factor in political objectives in their calculations, which is something that the European companies don't do, of course. So in China, the calculations on the part of companies are not exclusively economic calculations. And that's a major difference. So broadly speaking, what we can say is that there is a politicization of everything in China. And it's even more the case today, since today ideology prevails over everything else in China. That's again a major difference in terms of how companies work and how they actually behave. So in the case of the EU, we tended to think in a siloed way. So there was the economy on the one hand and politics on the other hand. And the two things were totally separate. In China, these two things have never been separate. Never. And today we realize that perhaps we have to think a little bit like the Chinese. Otherwise, we don't play the same game. And so we are actually in a very, very difficult situation. So I think that this is really the major difficulty today. And, well, perhaps the EU has started opening its eyes. It's really slightly more clear-eyed than in the past. And it realizes that it has to act more or less like China. Otherwise, it will be in really very bad shape.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about what is the European Union doing in order to be a little bit more like China, in order to protect its economic interests. What has it been doing as part of the de-risking? Maybe we can talk a little bit about the tariffs, and maybe we can later talk about what is the Chinese reaction and how European businesses are doing in China in more specific terms. Alicia, maybe you can go forward.
So I just want to give a little bit of perspective to that question, because if we put all of this together, I think where we are is where China was when China entered the WTO, just that it is slightly bigger. Yeah, in the sense that we have a China that grows out of exports. So it grows its way out of exports because consumption and investment are well below GDP growth. And so far, so good. It's just that because China is 8 times bigger than it was then, it has enormous consequences for the rest of the world. So that's the combination. And I think this would be true independently on the political intent of the whole thing. Meaning, it so happens there is a political intent which makes things worse. The war makes it worse. You know, the fact that China doesn't really, I think it's the party itself probably doesn't want China to become a consumption economy. I think ideologically, all of those things are important. But for me, what really matters for the EU, rather than just even judging that, is that China is enormously large and still relies on exports for its growth model. I think that's it. And the question is it all natural? China is so competitive. You were saying that, you know, we're no longer able to export to China because China is just more competitive than us. But I think that has a little bit of a, I mean, I understand the argument, but I think it's a little bit overdone. I think there is sectors where Europe could remain competitive, but there is forced localization. There's forced, I mean, basically targets for European companies in China, and Jens knows this in and out, but also Chinese companies not to import. So the target is really the domestic economy, and therefore it's not only about being more competitive. This is why we're reacting. I think this is exactly the problem, that if any other country were doing this, and many are, like even Taiwan for that matter, has localization rules on offshore wind farms. But the problem is it's just too tiny to make a difference. China is no longer tiny, and it does make a difference. So our de-risking strategy basically is all about that. It's about trying to figure a way to survive in this humongous kind of plan of driving a huge economy out of exports. I mean, nobody of that size would do that. The US has never done that. Japan, when it did in the 80s, it got hit. Yeah, so. But of course, China can't be hit because China has the military basically independence that Japan didn't have, and many other things. So what do we do with the risk? But here I'm just frankly saying that our de-risking is, I would say, mild to say the least compared to the amount of the problem. And not only that,
too late? Or is
That was
it
the
just too
title
mild?
of my newsletter that is not yet out. Too late, too little. So you got it, what I wanted to say. I think it's too little and too late. But it's not maybe our fault. Maybe the Commission has done a great job calculating all of these subsidies and imposing countervailing duties. But the point is, it doesn't really matter because the US is imposing 100, Turkey is imposing 40. So it's not about us deciding what's the level of protection. It's a relative term. And that's why it's too little and too late, because we've come after Turkey. I'm sorry, but it's like we can't argue that we've been quick on this one. It's taken really a long time, and many other investigations which were supposed to be 180 days have not yet been decided. So yes, we're too late, and I actually think the little is all based on the relative terms. That's why it's too little. Yeah. Okay,
so now we are concentrating on how to protect European economic interests. And in this respect, maybe we can talk just a little bit about maybe the more vocal way of protecting Europe, which is the EVs. Can we talk about whether this policy of protecting our automotive market has any hopes of success?
Well, just quick word on that, and I'll leave Jens give more details. But I was listening to the radio over lunch, and apparently China is contemplating imposing tariffs on European exports of cars, regular cars, not electric vehicles. And I think they are in a very good position to do that. First thing, it will hurt, and hurt a lot, in particular German car makers, of course. And on top of that, they have in some way, a moral advantage. Because what they are saying is that we are putting tariffs on these dirty cars, whereas you Europeans are putting tariffs, imposing tariffs on electric vehicles, which are clean vehicles. So what are you doing? So I think they are really in a very, very comfortable position. I think we are, again, in rather bad shape. So, protecting through tariffs, well, I'm not sure that's the way to go. And again, EU is not in the best of positions. But these tariffs about regular cars have not been confirmed. I don't know whether it's fake news or not. It was on BBC, so I trust BBC. But it's just China contemplating the idea of imposing such tariffs. It's not yet done. But apparently it's a response to the tariffs imposed by the EU.
And there I think maybe it's useful to keep in mind that when you look at trade flows, and as I explained before, that Europe is a very large market for China, but China is a not so large market for Europe. And that, I think, actually last year, European exports to China were only 23% larger than European exports to Switzerland, just to put it into perspective. Which is...
But you are talking about automotive? Or?
No, overall trade. Yeah, and that's what people don't get. Of course, European companies have a very significant presence inside of China, but that is not necessarily something that, create jobs and pay taxes and all that, the good stuff here in Europe. And I think that is the problem now, that it is sometimes becoming a little bit harder for European business to explain the benefit case of moving jobs from Europe to China, and why that's a good thing for Europe. I actually think that there's something to be said for the Commission's approach. I think now with this raft of initiatives, investigations, and what have you not, that Europe got China's attention, and Europe has managed to a certain extent to build a platform for discussion and put China on noticing, saying this time. It's serious. Of course, at the end of the day, it depends on the will to follow through with these things. And I think that is the thing. But that's entirely up to Europe itself to get its own house in order. I think where I have the issue is, you look at the term trade defense instrument. It's defensive. It's not offensive. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves, that is, when you look at key European strategically important industries, where is Europe going to be 10, 20, and 50 years from now? And then you need to work backwards. There's no size fits all. And, you know, there will be one answer to the automotive industry. There will be another one for ICT. There'll be a third one for wind. And I think we need to learn from the Chinese in the sense that they have always been very good at working at a very granular industrial perspective, looking at individual verticals. And that is part of the reason that they have been effective in their industrial policy. And I frankly think that we can, you know, learn something. You know, if you're setting 500 or 5,000 European companies, it's difficult. It's actually impossible to agree on anything. But if you're sitting in a room and you're only Nokia and Ericsson, or you're only Vestas and Siemens Gamesa, then you can agree and find out what the right thing is to do. And I actually think in a certain way it can help to protect trade because, you know, it's not everything that's strategic. 98% of all Christmas ornaments come from EU in China. No one cares about Christmas ornaments, right? But probably maybe 80% of all trade is unproblematic. And if China wants to subsidize it, so be it. But the 20% that are problematic and the 20% that ultimately are the sectors that will allow us in Europe to be masters of our own destiny, these we need to have our opinion on. I think the risk right now is because we don't talk enough about the 20%, we risk a spillover into the 80% that are actually unproblematic. And that's what we see with pork right now, right? There's no reason that pork should be part of it. That should just be traded. But because in lack of better things, this is how it ends up. So what we need to do now is to begin to think in terms of outcomes. Right now, you know, we talk about the situation right now and then do tactics. But we don't really ask ourselves the question, what is it we need to do to get to the desired end goal? And I think these are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves and the discussions we need to have. And again, I actually think it's much easier for the Chinese side to accept because China has been doing things for its own industrial resilience for the past 30 years. Right? If you go out and say you're trading unfair, right, then it becomes, you know, a question about I'm right, no, and you're wrong, right? And it's very difficult for China to accept. But I think if you come and say, see, this here is core to European industrial resilience, core to European industrial future and security, then I think it's a different kind of discussion and one that China might arguably understand. So I think we need to begin to have these conversations, even though I think with WTO and everything that it might be difficult, and because free trade is so hard baked into our DNA. We still like free trade. My day job is in shipping. And by the way, just one thing there, everyone is talking about nearshoring, friendshoring and everything, but I think the estimate we have out there is that the global growth in container traffic is around 6% this year. It's twice as high as the growth in the global economy. So I don't see deglobalization. It might move around a little bit, but the stuff moving around is increasing ahead of growth, global growth. So let's keep that in mind also. Thank you.
So even more international trade. Now let's maybe go back to China itself. Especially Alicia, you explained some long-term Chinese economic strategy and sort of economic resilience strategy. Is this partly directed towards the EU? My question is whether we are just suffering from Chinese decisions on how to build a resilient economy that is dominating, or are some of these very unfriendly policies directed especially at the EU? And if they are there any political factors in this? Is this a political play, or is it just China developing economically the way it wants?
Yes, very quickly. I think we need to realize that the EU has long been, and still is actually, in 2023, not in 2022 because of course, oil and gas prices, but in 2023, again, the European Union has the larger trade surplus than China. So we actually are, maybe we can call competitor, but maybe China sees it as an economic rival. Yeah, maybe China sees it as an economic rival before we even came up with this concept, you know, and this is it. So why would China needs to compete with us in third markets. China needs to compete with us in our own market because it's their largest market, export market. So, you know, do we want to add some geopolitics to this. Russia, I mean, we may, but frankly, we don't need it because this is important enough for China to move up the ladder and basically substitute our imports. Because for the US, this is a different game. That's hegemony. For us, it's economics. And China, in a way, does see us as a zero-sum game, in my view. So this is why this is happening.
Okay, Jean-Pierre?
Can I add a few things on that? Yes, I mean, I think, as you know, I mean, the global picture of our relationship with China is that we promote economic cooperation with China as much as possible. We are more and more economic competitors. And that's funny you mentioned the economic rivals. You know, the official expression, the official wording of the EU Commission is that we are more and more systemic rivals. And the systemic rival dimension is overtaking the other dimension of the relationship. And if you go to Brussels, everyone is going to tell you that. Now, because of the geopolitical tensions, but also because of China's own de-risking policy. And that's something we have to bring in here. Because China has been also implementing a de-risking or decoupling or partial decoupling policy in promoting its own R&D, own technology. I mean, China's ambition is to catch up with the US, clearly. And here we're somewhat outside of the game. The EU tends to be marginalized. I mean, that's a very sad thing. And we have to wake up to remain competitive in a number of areas like chips, semiconductors, quantum technologies, and artificial intelligence. Otherwise, we're going to be out of the game, and the game will be played by the US and China. Now, China is risking, and one thing I have to mention here is that in the last 10 years, maybe even with the growing tension you've mentioned with China, certainly the growing tension with the US, the Chinese government is trying more and more to balance economic development with security. So there's been a securitization of everything in China. If you go to China, everything is anquan, they apply the concept of security to everything, cultural security, you name it. Environmental security, but energy security and so on, food security, but and regime security, of course, and that's one of the major concerns of Xi Jinping. So in that context, I don't think that China is really targeting EU more any other places, but China is playing its own game, and I have to say that to react to some of the sanctions that have been announced so far. China has announced 2 investigations, one on the pork meat and pork, all sort of, really, in China, you eat everything on the pig, so it goes from the ears to the tail to the stomach and everything. So it's a big market. I think it's a market of $6 billion for the EU, but it's meaningful. But then there's another investigation has been announced on spirits and cognac, as you know. But it's not done. I think the reaction so far has been rather subdued, I would say, because I think China's ambition is to cultivate the EU, to mitigate the impact of all the sanctions, the counter-sanctions taken on both sides. Again, because China's objective is still to drive a wedge between the US and the EU as much as possible. So I think we have to take that on board to adopt the best strategy to defend our interests, both political interests, but also economic and trade interests, I think. Okay,
so I understand that. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something, connecting something that has been said by Alicia and something that just has been said by Jean-Pierre. Alicia said that the de-risking strategy was too little, too late. And I would add, it's also too defensive. A major problem is that, well, in the European de-risking strategy, you have 3 Ps, right? So it's protect, and we've been talking about protect so far. The second P is promote, and the third P is partner. And I think that the de-risking strategy in Europe is a little bit too weak on the second P, which is promotion. And promotion is exactly what China has been doing. Industrial policy is behind China's economic strategy. It's all about industrial policy. But industrial policy is something that is, to some extent, a rude word in Europe. You're not supposed to engage in industrial policy. The economy is intervention-free. So it's all about free trade, free market, free whatever. No intervention, please. Well, in France, we have some difficulties with that. We are much more interventionist, as you may know. And so we perfectly understand what industrial policy is all about. We are not necessarily very good at it, but we understand what it is. The EU was, until very recently, very much anti-industrial policy. So the new conditions that have been imposed by China on the one hand, but by the US on the other hand, have imposed a paradigm shift in the EU. We also have to think in terms of industrial policy, otherwise, again, we'll be left, out of the game. So there has been this change. The problem, I think, is that there is a funding issue. If you want to have a strong industrial policy, what you need is a lot of funds. But for the time being, all the aids, government support, are in the hands of the member states and not of the Commission. And this is a major problem. There has been an attempt by Commissioner von der Leyen to set up some kind of a fund, technology fund, but this has been rejected by the member states. And so we have something like a fund, but it's very, very small compared to what it was supposed to be at the very beginning. So we have this problem of industrial policy, which is underfunded. And as a result, it is not strong enough, not dynamic enough compared to the other competitors that we have to face with. And so this is a problem of the de-risking strategy, I think. It's also too defensive. Well, we may be discussing the partner part, the third P, but I don't know whether it's of any interest so far.
All right, so there is another issue also with the European Union really needing to have a common policy in the sphere of the whole in feeling about industrial policy, but also economy that overpowers, overrides national interests, which is always a very difficult thing for the European Union to do. Now, until now, we have concentrated mostly on discussing what we can do economically to protect economic interests of the European Union states. But another question that I would like to ask you is about European businesses in China and how they are doing and how they sort of learn to swim in the new environment, which is more and more demanding in China. You talked a little bit about securitization of everything. We haven't mentioned the issue of legal and regulatory changes. And I think maybe we can talk a little bit about these two things. So, speaking about European businesses in China, what has changed for them and what are they doing facing these changes?
Let me take that one. But first, I just want to reflect a little bit on what Jean-Pierre just mentioned before, that China's response has been moderate. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that given the importance of the European market and also the extent to which that it's actually irreplaceable, because you have Europe and Japan and United States, in particular United States and Europe, having these very large deficits with China. I mean, no one else can really. You cannot just move these around and ask the global South to take that. It's not going to happen, right? So Europe is really important in that respect. I think what is a little bit frustrating for the Chinese right now, that is that very often they do not really understand what it is Europe wants. What is it China needs to do?
Do we
to
know
comply?
What we want?
That was back to my problem, right? But if you only think in terms of trade defense tools, then you don't talk about what it is you really want to achieve, right? And I think that's where we need to go and say, dear Chinese friends, we love your products, you're very welcome in the market, but this is how it's going to work, right? I think China has been very good at doing exactly that, and maybe we can learn a little bit there, being more explicit in what our expectations are. And then I actually think that even though some of it might sound difficult and hard, but I actually think it's the thing that might enable a solution if we are explicit. I mean, I don't know if any of you who have children will know what I'm saying. If you're not concrete and specific in terms of what you want, things are not going to happen. They're going to run around you in circles. And I think a little bit in politics, it's the same, right? That you need to be concrete and specific, and then you can begin to have solutions. It, of course, works the other way around also. I mean, I'm not sitting here and belittling China, but I just think in terms of achieving results, that's how it works. You need to tell it how you really want it to be. back to China, I think, I don't remember who it was that mentioned it, but there is this sort of, I would say, almost schizophrenic feeling sometimes whether it's security or whether it's opening the economy. I mean, I've had better meetings over the past 6 months in China at a higher level than I've had the past 25 years. And sometimes it's also the difference between local economies that are willing to do whatever it takes to attract someone who can generate economic activity. But I do, and I do think that desire is genuine. But then you have the other side of the government. I mean, I come from business, right? And it's a little bit when you have a dysfunctional company, you have a finance department that says you need to get your SG&A cost under control, and then you have the sales team saying that it takes money to make money, right? Which one is it, right? And I think that's sometimes where it's difficult to get that balance right, but I think it's very dynamic, and I think it changed, and I think that China will course correct according to what it thinks is correct. But I think it's important also to recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all for European companies. They depending on what industry you're in, the size you have, the criticality of the Chinese market, there will be different responses. I mean, many of the big MNCs, they will continue to invest in China because they will simply cease to be large global companies if they're not in China, and also because a lot of the very interesting things in terms of technology are happening in China. But then you have other companies that are beginning to hedge, and we see that very clearly as a trend. About a quarter of our members, they are moving parts or the entirety of their supply chains out of China. A lot of that is due to labor arbitrage, it had to be said. It's not all politics. But on the other hand, we have also a quarter of our members actually increasing their onshoring into China. So, building in China for China supply chain and rest of world for rest of world supply chains. And I think that now we can establish as a firm trend that we see sort of a bifurcation of supply chains. That's an issue. Not so much for the MNCs, but for that backbone of the European economy, the SMEs. A lot of them will not have the capital, they will not have sort of the human resources, the bandwidth to actually operate two separate supply chains. We see, a number of, not so many, but some SMEs leaving China and not so many coming in, and I think that's one of the reasons. But I think the main group of companies right now, they're sitting on the fence and trying to, form an opinion on how things going to develop. And I think some of them might decide over time that maybe it's better to leave, and some will decide that they can stay. But what we can see now is that the concerns now and the expectations to the future are changing to an extent where we can see now that companies are beginning to adapt. And I think that is a new thing compared to last year. That is that companies are beginning to make adjustment based on changed expectations. 52% of our members 1,780 member companies, 52% of those said that they're going to cut costs in the present year. 26%, a little bit more than a quarter of our members, are planning to lay off people. That's quite a bit. So something fundamentally has changed in that respect. And that is going to take time to change that, sentiment. And that, of course, makes it even more important that the government focuses listening to what we have to say in terms of improvements.
All right, that's really interesting first-hand relation of what is happening and how differentiated the picture is. And we can't really sum it up in 2 words, Jean-Pierre.
Yes, I think we have to come back to the domestic situation in China. And the third plenum, which should take place next month, as you know, the third plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. The economic situation in China is bad. And the perception is that it's pretty bad, actually. Not only because of the local government's debt, which is an issue, nearly 100% of the GDP, but also because of the housing sector is in bad shape and is not going to recover very quickly. It will take time. So clearly, there's a lot of stake at the third plenum. People around Xi Jinping are getting ready for the third plenum. We don't know, of course, what's going to happen with the third plenum. But there's been a number of indicators I think we can talk about, like the recent visit Xi Jinping paid to Northeast China, ex-Manchuria, which is maybe the part of China, what we call Dongbei, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning. There's been the most affected parts of China in terms of economic growth, lack of employment, internal migration of people from Northeast China to the rest of China. So they need to do something about it. But the situation is more concerning also in terms of, as you said, I mean, because it's the whole overall structure of the Chinese economy is still driven by exports. So how to move from an export-led economy to a consumption-led economy? It's not going to be easy. Xi Jinping is promoting, as you know, high quality growth, but it's maybe not enough to rebalance the economy. I think one of the things which the government is going to decide upon, among other things, is both to relax, I think, some of the economic structure in favor of the private sector, which is in China, as you know, under some kind of leash. Maybe they're going to lose the leash a bit because you have party branches in a lot of meaningful, big private firms. But I think they want to give more space. And you see that dialogue taking place between Xi Jinping and Li Qiang, the prime minister. You know, Xi Jinping being more on the state-owned side, and Li Qiang playing the private sector game. But one of the concerns also is the fact that there's been a drop in FDIs in China. The lack of, and in Hong Kong we can see that there's a lack of confidence, including among Hong Kong economic actors in investing in China, both Chinese and non-Chinese actors. So and the other thing is maybe, and we'll finish on the I don't know, speculating about this. One of the rumors which are circulating in China and social media and elsewhere, is the fact that maybe Xi Jinping is going to relax a bit the political environment, giving more space to Deng Xiaoping. You remember Deng Xiaoping?
No, we don't. We forgot about this guy.
So, collective leadership, maybe maybe toning down the cult of personality. In China, you can't start an article, including publishing an academic article, without quoting Xi Jinping on the first line. Otherwise, your article is not going to be published in China. So, are they going to make some changes? I've heard that they're going to say more about Deng Xiaoping. It's a slight signal they want to relax a bit the political environment. Because there's a lot of frustration among young Chinese people. I can see that through my students coming from China in Hong Kong. They're very frustrated about the situation in many ways. So we can talk about that later. But I wanted to one if I may add, one thing about the EU side, I think China is is also very settled and know how to divide and rule, and apply counter measures and counter tariffs. China is very much aware of the fact that the EU is divided, that even Germany itself is divided. I think we have some friends from Germany here. As far as what kind of China policy Germany should adopt, because there are conflicting lobbies and interests, and the measure we are going to be taken by China are going to take into account those conflicting interests and going to sort of please the lobbies which favor an engagement with China, and as opposed to the one who are more realist and more critical of China.
Yeah, well, I understand that China is not only aware of it, but it's actively using it in order to gain what it needs to gain. Okay, so actually you've been pointing to several things. So first of all, European Union needing an industrial policy, and then needing to be assertive not only in a defensive way, but also in sort of rule-setting way of how the economic cooperation should be shaped. But also you talked about the situation not being hopeless, but actually China needing Europe very much, and European companies in China, while only probably strong and big players who can afford to sort of divide the supply chains and divide the markets could thrive in China now, whereas before it was a more versatile type of a place. What is the future? If we think about like next 20 years, in China, this is not a shockingly long perspective. How should we play, and is there a place for us in the world in 20 years where we have, I don't know how the...
Here, be very careful.
Well, exactly. Well, let's give them maybe a little bit of hope. What shall we do?
Well, I first want to say something which is unrelated. Sorry, because I was, grabbing the mic just to say that, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you're so positive on the third plenum, but I'm not at all. I don't have any how would I say, any specific information or anything that would put me in a better position to judge, to be frank. But it's just my gut feeling because of exactly this reality. You just said it. We're important for China. And they don't care. I mean, this is why I'm just arguing, sorry, out of, pure common sense, maybe, I don't know, my common sense, that if Europe is so important for China, how on earth are we here? Xi Jinping visited France, François knows very well, and he didn't even acknowledge the problem. I mean, are we really thinking that but put it this way, go back to Ukraine, your point on Ukraine. I mean, nothing has changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. Basically, China is at the brink of being really in a difficult position with secondary sanctions, not us, but the US again. And still, they don't seem to care. I mean, at least, yes, I know we are there's data showing very clearly they're reducing payments in RMB, Russia-related payments, and even India is. But as far as we are concerned, with Europe, I don't see any reaction.
But is it not because they feel that it's a cost they need to take because there are other priorities? They do care, but
we're not so important. And in this very same way, and you may think it's unrelated, but I think eventually it is related, I doubt they will change what Xi Jinping has been doing since he came, just for the third plenum, just because the situation is getting worse. Because in my humble opinion, they knew for a fact that things would not, I mean, the structural deceleration in the Chinese economy, I think by now, sorry to say, even my mom knows this. It's just impossible to deny it. Structural deceleration, fast structural deceleration. Because most of those factors pushing down the economy are impossible to stop. So, so what is he going to do in this third plenum? Inventing the wheel? I mean, giving more power to the sector that he's already taken power from, the private sector? Why? Just because the economy, bear in mind the economy might grow 5% this year. What is his reasoning to change all of those policies? Well, what's going to push him? Actually, it's working quite well. We come with these minor tariffs. If you cooperate with us, 18% only BYD. I mean, come on. And do you think that this is going to impress them? And in the same way, do you think that hitting 5% target is going to really hurt them to the point of doing something dramatic at the third plenum? My sense is no. I hope I'm wrong. But I'm just saying I don't see how that bunker that, is going to change direction at the speed needed to change the economic outlook. And I finish by saying what's the economic outlook in a nutshell, because we have a bunch of papers for this horizon, so we need to make some publicity here. So the numbers are pretty clear. Yeah, I mean, it's not even our numbers, NDRC's numbers with the World Bank in many years ago. 2.3%, that's ours, but you can put it where you want, 2035. That's the US growth, potential growth. That means, and we've said this so many times, China will not, unless something happens in the US, will not be the largest economy in the world. I'm sorry. And from there, because of aging, and again, this we've written a lot, divergence, 1% growth, Japan. So if that's your scenario, I mean, frankly, you should have changed your policies in the previous third plenum. I don't see any reason, because the direction is already clear. So for me, China is really getting ready. I guess the other option is nationalism. I mean, finding things to say, look, we're here because of you. Not we're here because of us. So, I mean, I know this is what you think, Jacques. I'm just... play
I think the China is not related to the EU. I don't think we have any impact on what's going to be decided by the third plenum. It's more related to the state of the Chinese economy. And I agree with you. There won't be any meaningful structural changes. But at the same time, they need to create jobs, and the provinces, the cities need to create jobs. So they will have some. There will be some adjustment. It doesn't mean that they're going to weaken the leadership of the party, or it's going to change the system whatsoever, or even the structure of them. The SOEs are going to remain protected in many ways. Industrial policy subsidies will remain in place. But they more agree with you. There will be more headwinds for the Chinese economy as the growth rate is going to decelerate, and so that's where we are. But
so what's the long-term perspective? A resilient second world economy, self-sufficient, unaffected by American sanctions and American policies, but not very prosperous, with huge internal problems, and still a strong manufacturer and a strong exporter.
You mentioned nationalism. I think if there's something we can, I don't know whether the EU can have a meaningful role there. I think it's the major objective is to prevent a war, in the Taiwan Strait. If we can prevent a war and keep China at peace, I think it's already not bad. So I don't want to exaggerate the risk of war, because that's something I've been working on for quite a while. I think China is playing very well within the gray zones in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and even in the Taiwan Strait. So to move from this gray zone strategy to a full-fledged aggression of Taiwan with the U.S. in the bag, I think it's another game. So but still, I think with the rise of nationalism, there are risks. And even if the war in Ukraine has been, in my view, additional factor forcing Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership to think twice before starting war against Taiwan. But we have to be aware of those risks. And yes, I think that's why there is this priority given to security, in a sense, because of these new economic environment, this slow growth rate, more frustration within society, and also more isolation from the rest of the world. And that's something we haven't mentioned, people-to-people relations. It's not easy to develop people-to-people relations with a country like China, because everything is so much controlled by the state, be it the central state, the local state, the party state, of course. That is not easy, but we can still play a role, because the Chinese society is changing, and I'm not too hopeful whether we can rely on the Chinese society to put pressure on their government, but at the same time we still should try to engage with China. So that's what I would say. But yes, I agree with you that China will remain number 2 for a long time in terms of overall GDP. I don't think that China, as a whole, in terms of nominal GDP, will overtake the US before 2040 or 2050. But eventually it will, with 1.4 billion people against 300 or 400 million, of course. But it will mean that China will remain 4 times poorer than the US. That's what it will mean by that time.
And then there is India as well.
And India, but India will remain behind anyway.
Yeah. Okay, some last remarks, because I would like to open the floor for questions as well.
Yeah. Maybe just a little bit of reflection on the mood in China. And I think, we should, of course, keep in mind that sort of the real constituency of Xi Jinping and the party is not really sort of the well-educated youth in the big cities. It's the 80% living in tier 3, 4, and 5 cities and the countryside. But, the many young Chinese people I talk to, they despair at the thought of China becoming more isolated. I think there's a very, very strong desire for China to be a part of the world when you talk to these young people. And that is frankly something that gives me a little bit of hope, that you have this, it is not the primary constituency by any means, but it is well-educated, resourceful young people who are advocating for it. As for trade, I don't really see any scenario unless it comes to a hot conflict where China's share of global export is actually falling. I think it's not going to increase a lot because it's already at an all-time high proportion of global trade, but I think it's actually going to stay there. It's going to grow in line with the global trade growth, simply because in so many areas China is just enormously competitive. And then just there was this slightly pessimistic note about what about young people in Europe if Europe is going down the drain. I think the ultimate test is to ask yourself, where do you want your kids to grow up and live? And I have kids in both United States and in China. I want my kids to live in Europe. And I think it was Alicia who reminded me a while ago that, you know, for the past 150 years, we are talking about how bad things are going in Europe. And, you know, I come here, I live in China, but I come here, I just see so many things that are actually working really, really well. And we should not lose sight of that. So I still believe for my kids, this is the place to be. But we need to get our act together. We need to work hard to keep it that way. And I think that is the task. But let's not get defeatist.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm still waiting for Françoise, whether you will be positive or not.
Well, I'm afraid I won't be positive, no. No, but the structural factors are very much against China. So among the headwinds, there is one very important structural factor, and that's demography. And demography is against China. So I don't agree with Jean-Pierre, who says optimistically that China, at the end of the day, will be the number one because it's so big. But it won't be big for long. There won't be 1.4 billion people for long. It will shrink. So I don't think that China will ever be number one just because of this specific factor. Demography is very, very much against China. And this is a long-term trend. I mean, this is something that you cannot change overnight. You know, the policies that have been put in place in China have not worked so far. I mean, they are pushing for the third kid, but the second one is not yet there. So you can't have the third one before the second one, as far as I know. Even I don't have kids, so I don't know, but still. So there is a problem here, and I think it's a major structural factor that is very much negative for China.
If I can just add, this is what really differentiates China and also Europe and Japan and Korea and Taiwan from the US, where you have such huge migrations that you don't have this demographic problem. And the question is whether East Asian countries would ever be psychologically and culturally ready to have huge migrations into the countries. That would be difficult to imagine.
I just want to add, to answer your question was really good. Like, what's going to happen to China? Big industrial power, but not the largest economy in the world, based on... I think a lot depends on... Because hegemony you can get through your economy, the size of your economy. I don't think that's going to happen. But you can also get hegemony through developing... First, strategic dependencies. China is working very hard on that. Second, the currency, military, soft, hard power, you name it, yeah? And there we have RMB, which I think is not the key to this thing, but we also have the Global South. And on the innovation side, if we believe the economists, I believe in the 80 million patents that Mikhail is working on, where it doesn't show what the economy says, but the point is this is a big question mark. So, you know, I think these are the key question marks to me. The power of innovation in China, not for the economy, not to grow, but to create these strategic dependencies like the US creates on everybody else, and the Global South. For me, these are the two big question marks. The RMB, and this is Alessia's work, comes in a way with the second. Comes as a support to the Global South. If we know about these two things, will China dominate key emerging technologies? Will China always have the upper hand on the Global South? Maybe we should change our view beyond the economic size of China.
Okay, Jean-Pierre, quickly, and then we go with questions.
So I fully agree with Alicia on the Global South. I think we tend to overlook the fact, I mean, that's something we discussed earlier in a small room. We tend to overlook the fact that China is making headways in the Global South to the detriment of the US, of course, but also to the detriment of the European Union. So we have to change the way we interact with the Global South, we cooperate with the Global South. The Global Gateway, the first step in the right direction, but it's far from being enough, clearly. We have to change our way of developing cooperation with the Global South, and otherwise China is going to, I wouldn't say dominate, but to create dependencies which are very beneficial to China and detrimental to us.
But just on the global south, I think again there is a sort of an increasing concern, at least with the people that I talk to, that countries in the global south will simply not be able to industrialize because they are being flooded with these very, very cheap goods, and I do sort of pick up on an increased frustration, and also sort of a desire to hedge, to make sure that dependencies do not get so deep that there's no way out. And I think it's really up to EU and the US to seize on these opportunities. And again, it's entirely within our powers to do so, but whether we get around to do it is the other question, I think.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. We will sum up in a sec, but I want to also give a chance to people present here in the room to ask questions and maybe direct the discussion to places or things we haven't touched. Okay. So I will move around the room. Anybody wants to start off? Any questions? Mikko.
Thank you so much. I have a question to the economists and Jens on overcapacities. Even the term is contested. The Chinese deny that this exists or that it's a misunderstanding. And we don't get the central role of the way how manufacturing capacity is simply being built up strategically. And I was wondering whether you can help us navigate a little bit how this is going to play out moving forward beyond the EV case. I think Jens, you've been very outspoken about the fact that this is a train crash, slow moving happening in a way. But I wonder, do you recognize any sense of willingness on the Chinese side to discuss this matter on better terms maybe, or where are sectors where you see this problem emerging most quickly, where we need to find political responses beyond the specific EV case at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks. And I think the crash is here by now. And what never ceases to amaze me is the tolerance for waste in the system that you see now. I mean, you have 144 individual EV brains several times, the combined number of EV brains outside of China, right? You have, I hear, wind companies offering turbines with 5 years deferred payment. I mean, how can you make money on this, right? And the waste is just so immense. As you mentioned, I've been talking about overcapacity for a while, and China does not like the term. You can call it also overstimulation of the supply side or externalize the low domestic demand or whatever you choose. But we see the same things happening. We see increase in inventories. We see deflation now for 20 years running in producer prices, 20 months running in producer prices. We see margin erosion. We see loss of market share. These are all things that you would typically associate with overcapacity. I don't think we should get bogged down in semantics, and I think we are making a mistake if we are discussing semantics. We should talk about all the other factors and what the root causes of these are. We asked our members, and the majority of our members who actually have a supply chain, they responded, and it was almost, I think, 60 or 65% said, yes, overcapacity is for real. We feel it now, or we'll feel it within 2 years. 71% of those who see overcapacity, and we used actually the word overcapacity, not the other things, but 71 of them said that they were losing or their margins were declining, and 42% of them said that they were losing margins very significantly. 42% were losing market share, in particular within ICT and pharma, and then one other sector, machinery. More than 50% indicated that they were losing market share. However, there were also 29% who were actually increasing market shares. But there's no doubt this is for real. It's hurting companies. And that's again where, in particular, anything that's related to construction. And really, in the widest sense, construction, it's also washers and TV sets and everything, all these things you buy when you have a new one. What we have seen pre-COVID was that 80% produced was for the domestic market and 20% for export. Now, in many cases, it has turned around, so that 80% for export and 20% for local ones. So, I mean, I think a lot of this is recognized, but it's just so politically loaded, that term overcapacity, that maybe we would serve everyone by phrasing it in different terms. And I think one thing that they will be able to really latch on to is if we talk about waste, because no one likes that, in particular China, in a time when the money is not really there.
Yeah,
All right.
I'll be very brief. I think the whole point is we don't really need to show that China has overcapacity. Our anti-subsidy investigation doesn't need that. It's all about the amount of subsidies. So I don't know why we get into this. It just doesn't add anything. And on top of that, if in a way, I mean, if the whole thing is about rivalry, if China has overcapacity in sectors where there's no major basically where the economies of scale are not huge. So I would be more worried if China were dominating, for example, digital services. Because there, for 1 unit of investment, you can have infinite. But if they have overcapacity in EVs, it's a problem, in a way, as long as we stop it. But the point is, the more we stop it, the more deflation they get, the more it hurts. If they don't want to accept overcapacity, I don't see why this is our problem. The problem is that we basically accept that those lower prices, subsidized prices. But I mean, I think we're playing the wrong game here, quite clearly on this one. We should basically say, okay, if this is like any anti-dumping investigation. It's the same thing, anti-subsidy, anti-dumping investigation. You're working below market prices, so we don't get it. And this is WTO compliant and enough. If you have overcapacity, actually, and I finish here, the overcapacity doesn't come from the subsidies. I think this is the problem, I feel. It comes from the fact that China has only one factor of growth, which is exports, plus fixed asset investment in manufacturing. It's the only thing that grows above 5%, these two. So basically, they are forced to create overcapacity unless we absorb it all, which we shouldn't. I mean, and that's it. That's it. We just don't import anything that is produced below production prices. And that's it. And if they don't want to call it overcapacity, it's their problem. So I fully agree with you. I think we are embarked in this kind of, I don't know, like Santo, this is it. I can't remember the name in English. Santo Tomas, yeah, like the sex of the angels, as they used to say. Why name this thing? Yes. It's hurting us, and it brings nothing good to the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, Jean-Pierre, briefly.
There's one factor which has not been mentioned. We'll mention very briefly. Is local protectionism in China. Every province, every city protects itself. So if you try to have your car, you buy a car from another province, have it registered in your province, you get a hard time. Because that's the funny thing, they accuse us of protectionism. Well, the provinces and cities in China are very protectionist in many ways.
Okay, thank you. Let's have some other questions. Robin?
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I have a question perhaps for Jean-Pierre. China has increased the number of civil servants, and we just talked about local protectionism. And do you see that there's any push from the government that, the government has also advocated for a unified national market. Do you see that this is going to lead to perhaps more formalized institution and also to stronger law enforcement on the local level?
Should I answer that? Okay. Oh, well. It's a difficult question, and the short answer is no. Of course, it's an objective. It's been a public objective laid down by Xi Jinping is to create a national market. To integrate the whole national market. But the problem is that provinces and cities, more and more cities, what we call that the prefectural level cities, are so powerful, and the resources they come from themselves. So they don't rely so much on the center, and they have to. Local cadres and Calderich knows that better than I do. Is leading cadres at the local level, leading officials. If they want to perform, they want to get promoted, they have to demonstrate that they've played a role in developing the economy, keeping social stability and fighting an environment. So, I mean, they have to meet all those boxes and to meet all those objectives at the same time. So, it's going to be very hard, and I don't see. So now, as legal security is concerned, well, I think China is it's there's a clearly a tension between professionals, jurists, judges, lawyers, and so on. Over the longer term, I think the jurists in China have become more professionals. But at the same time, the party state, it's very, very much hands-on as far as adjudication is concerned. The courts are not really independent. So yes, they can make. I mean, you know that better than I do. I mean, they can make examples in order to demonstrate they better protect intellectual property and the interests of the foreign investors and foreign companies. Same time, how much you can rely on that, on the precedents, I have still a lot of doubts. So I don't know. Do you want to add something on legal security in China? As far as from a business point of view, it's a very uneven picture. Maybe you get better protection in Shanghai, or Beijing, on Jiangsu, Zhejiang than in Gansu, but it's you have to look at case by case. So I would be cautious on that.
All right. Okay, let's proceed because we only have 10 minutes left and I hope to get a few more questions, maybe 2 or 3. And we see Professor Dominik Mierzejewski from the University of Łódź. Go ahead, Dominik.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. One quick comment to the issue of overcapacity, at least from my perspective as a China watcher. This is a product of the logic of mass mobilization campaigns. And to a certain degree, the Chinese economy and political economy is driven by this from cycle to cycle and mass mobilization. And I recently traveled southern China, Hong Kong and Guangzhou, and if you visit, you all know it. I mean, the mobile phones stalls in the big shopping malls, you see a lot of cars there, electric vehicles, that any single mobile phone producers producing cars at the moment. So that's a really an important issue for our understanding that what I said, this mass mobilization campaign. Regarding the local authorities, quickly, I think the unification of market is possible at the regional level. So what the Chinese government is trying to do at the moment is trying to unify market in Pearl Delta River, in Guangzhou, and also Hebei, Tianjin, Beijing. So at the regional level, it might be possible. But still, as was said by Jean-Pierre, the local protectionism is crazy. But my question is, how do you find the social changes in China, and to what degree the social changes influence, economic performance of European companies, mainly one-child policy and to a certain degree the patriotic feelings created by the central government towards younger people? Do you see, Jens, that's a particular question to you, I think. Do you see the relationship here? To what degree the social changes and patriotic education in particular influence the economic performance of European companies in China? Thank you.
I think it's a very good question. I think there are a number of European companies that has suffered exactly through that. And again, it typically comes in connection with the campaigns, if it's related to Xinjiang or Taiwan or what have you not. And I think, the big European sports clothes companies, I shall not mention them, but you have seen the likes of Anta and others really gaining market share and the growth of domestic strong brands, which I actually think in many ways is also a natural development that at some point in time you will actually begin to see domestic. But a lot of it clearly has been driven also by sort of some of these companies representing opinions or practices that are not seen as being aligned with what China stands for or against Chinese interest. But I think these are very, very specific sectors and not something that sort of perhaps have a wider impact on the trading relationship. There, I think, sort of government signaling is a much bigger part of it than sort of the stirring of nationalist feelings amongst the consumers. What I think, however, has changed and has changed quite significantly since the onset of COVID is that, there was always this feeling in China that tomorrow is going to be better than today. That's gone. And that just has such a dramatic impact on spending behaviors. It is not necessarily because the Chinese are not having the salaries, it's because they're not spending the money. They have the highest savings rate of anyone around, are just not feeling comfortable about spending. And I think this is something that's going to take a very long time to turn around. And I think it's something that will have a profound impact on the economy when you're not able to mobilize the Chinese consumer. In that sense, they are perhaps a little bit more like the Germans, but when we need them to be Americans. I mean, when the Americans feel unhappy, they go out and spend. And unfortunately, it's the opposite here. And it's just difficult for me to see exactly, absent of a rather significant investment into, for example, the pension system, healthcare, those things that could, in a credible way, that would take away this perceived need to save for a rainy day. The one thing, of course, that could change it is if suddenly you saw a big growth in the property market, but that's not going to happen in any, I think, conceivable world. Not just because the country is built up, but also because it's not politically desired. So I think that sort of the mood level, that it's down 3 notches compared to what it is, I think is probably now the most significant change that we have seen in terms of impact and also in terms of changing the conditions for European companies on the ground in China. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I think one short or 2 longer, more difficult questions. Anybody?
Okay, if so, okay.
Okay, we have one question here in front. Maybe I'll...
The new European Parliament is to switch its focus on EU competitiveness. Do you see a way to return to the investment agreement with China? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to go?
Very briefly, I think our quest for competitiveness doesn't go in line with signing that agreement. I don't see the relation between the two. But the only reason why that agreement would be back is that some of the populist parties that may be there could, possibly be closer to China than we think. But it seems strange because Meloni has been quite, one of the big winners. And I don't know, Alessia, what you think, but it doesn't seem to me as if China is going to be supported. But so, in other words, I don't see who is going to push that dead guy on the agenda at this moment. If anything, Europe will be more protectionist, in my view, with the current parliament, not less.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. One last question. Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up. My own feeling from the discussion, which I feel is really good also in terms of thinking about what our 2 consortia are doing, is that when you talk about the economy, you not only have to talk about politics, but you have to talk about the society. And actually what we are trying to do in our research is looking at these different places in describing the complexity of China, looking at the legal framework, economy, politics, society, culture, and hopefully this will tell us a little bit more about the complexity not only of China as it is today, but the path it is taking in the future. And everything is interconnected, and also there are no easy answers, as we have seen. And lots of question marks for the future, but also some positive things as well. So, I'm happy to hear that not all is lost, and we have some things we can do on the European side to protect our future. All right, absolutely. Thank you very much. So my guests today were Alicia Garcia Herrero from Bruegel in Brussels, Jens Eskalund from the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, Jean-Pierre Cabestin from Asia Center from Paris, and last but not least, Françoise Nicolas from Paris, from the French Institute of International Relations, representing ReConnect China, and the rest of us representing China Horizons DWARC. Thank you very much for this discussion, and thank to all of you who are here in the room and who are watching and listening to our discussion online. Thank you very much.